All right, it is just about 25 minutes before 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in this 11th day of September 2013. There are two reasons today for me to tell you the date. One is because we are remembering the 12th anniversary of the attacks on America, September 11th, 2001. And also because John Fuller is here, and I want you to know that he's here on the 11th. In case you happen to be listening to a rebroadcast, this is live. And that's important to you because it means if you have a question for John Fuller, it's a good way to get a hold of him right now by calling the WOCA Climate Control Source Hotline, which is 622-WOCA. John, of course, is an attorney here in Ocala at the law firm of Fuller and Fuller, and the other Fuller is his beautiful wife, Jenna. It's always interesting to be distracted by the listeners outside the window. Good morning, John. How you doing?
Good morning, Larry. Good morning to all of our friends who may be listening to this show. It is a pleasure to be here. I thought I might be in court today, but I got that resolved, so I'm not there. And it's much more pleasant to be here with you and with our folks who may be listening who have questions that involve a possible legal issue that affects them or their family or their loved ones. Or friends, and or if it's an issue that affects the judicial system and someone would like to have a question discussed that's in a general term, we certainly try to do that. I want to certainly add what you already commented on, that we are all mindful that today is a very significant day. It's the anniversary of an unspeakable horror that was unleashed in our country on September 11th, 2001. And we want to send our blessings and continued heartfelt wishes to everyone who suffered the loss of a loved one during that attack, and in addition to that, to all of our men and women in the armed forces who were mobilized after that to see that justice was done and our country was made safer, and take steps to see that the people responsible for that were brought to justice. And many people gave their lives for that and are still sacrificing for that. And we want to make certain that all of our listeners know that we respect and honor those folks and pray for their safety and thank them for their service.
The fact that we were talking about residual effects, I wanted to ask you a question about that. Now, not specifically with 911, but when you have a client who maybe has been accused of robbing or hurting or something like that, there's got to be a different approach than somebody who has been exposed to something and now they're sick, as what happened to some of the firefighters that responded on September 11th, who later on got sick. So how do you approach that? How do you convince a jury, I guess, that somebody is liable to pay the medical expenses when it's really hard to prove, I guess, that there's a direct connection between somebody else's...
Most insurance policies, if you read the fine print, which most people don't, and I must confess that I don't read the fine print in all the insurance policies I have, because candidly, there's very little you can do about it. If you want the coverage, you take their standard policy.
Exactly right.
But acts of war are excluded in a lot of excluded.
Oh, wow.
So then you get into the semantics of, well, war wasn't formally declared, so was this an act of war? How does an attack, terrorist attack, stack up? I want to say one thing, that after the disaster of 9/11, a lawyer in Miami named Larry Stewart, who's former president of the American Bar Association, a masterful trial lawyer. He's practiced law probably 10 years longer than I have. I think he's still practicing, but he was one of the real heroes, because he said, as a member of the legal profession, we need to do something. And so he put together a coalition of lawyers from all over the country to offer their services for free.
Really?
To represent the survivors
Wow.
of people who were killed in the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the flight that crashed in Pennsylvania. And to see, because there were funds, there were insurance funds, there were funds that the government made available. And the question is, how do you fairly measure damages? When you look at an individual who died and left a widow and 5 surviving minor children,
Right.
as opposed to someone who was a young single person who had no dependents, how do you make sure that the monies that were available to pay damages to these people who lost loved ones in that disaster were fairly compensated? Not that money damages ever fairly compensate someone for such a horrific loss, but it's really the only way our legal system and society has to try to help someone cope and to help replace the things that were missing as a result of the death of the loved one, whether it be in an automobile accident or whether it's in a disaster like 9/11 was. So Larry spearheaded that. He won a significant number of awards from various legal and philanthropic organizations, but it was a major undertaking, and I forget what the number of hours and the value of those hours were that were voluntarily dedicated and given by lawyers all over the country to come forward and represent those families, and not one lawyer got paid a penny.
Wow.
For doing
Really?
that.
Oh,
Yes.
wow.
And so, there's a lot to be said about our legal system. Certainly, there are cases where people have not distinguished themselves as much as one would hope they would in the legal profession, but they are some very noble people in it, and Larry Stewart was the spearhead that put that together, and thousands of lawyers all over the country volunteered their time, some more than others, but it was a big undertaking. And you ask, well, what do you do and how do you do it? And they jumped in and got into the nuts and bolts of it. And there was insurance. There were, and the question is, the traditional theory of recovery is negligence. Somebody did something negligently.
Right.
Who's responsible when you're attacked? But there are a lot of legal issues that arose out of that. That was certainly one tragedy, and how our legal system and our lawyers who work in the system tried to help those who were injured, and did help them to the full extent of the law. But we ended up with a lot of exceptionally far-reaching laws that gave tremendous power to the federal government and a whole bevy of federal agencies that I am to some degree troubled that it trampled on civil liberties. It's kind of, the end justifies the means, and the issue of due process and presumption of innocence, those were declared no longer viable defenses and legal options if a person was declared a armed enemy of the United States. And we have Guantanamo arise out of that. So it raised some very interesting questions. Many of them remain unanswered, and the society tries to strike a balance. How much liberty do you sacrifice to ensure the safety of our country? We had the same thing after Pearl Harbor, where many fine, loyal Japanese Americans who had absolutely nothing to do with the attack of Pearl Harbor were all rounded up and put in camps, and lost all of their rights of citizenship. And they've been, and ultimately the United States Supreme Court many years later ruled that was improper, that those were citizens, because they were of Japanese ancestry, that was a wrongful act by the government, but it got caught up in the hysteria of the moment. People were afraid that California and the West Coast was going to be invaded at any moment. People were sitting by the front door with their shotguns loaded, and I think it's interesting. We're just kind of rambling through constitutional issues. The Supreme Court said they ultimately were entitled to payment of money, reimbursements, and damages by the government.
Oh, wow.
And some of their ancestors and descendants who got that. So ultimately tried to make it right. That didn't help those people who were basically put in prison camps. But it was,
That is the way we make it right, though, in our country. In our system is money. I mean, there's no other way.
Well, there is no other way.
Yeah,
That's really tragic. If a person runs through a red light and runs into you while you're walking across the street and you have to have your leg amputated, tragically, there is nothing that can give you a new leg. We have a call.
Yes, sir. You do have a phone call. Good morning. You're on the air with John Fuller.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Fuller.
Good morning, sir. How are you today?
Very good, thank you. The family here has some very good friends, retired couple that were visiting Las Vegas a while back. Walking down the strip on a very windy day, a piece of a sign fell off the building and hit her and injured her quite seriously. She had several surgeries, and that naturally there was a lawsuit. It went to court. The final outcome of that was that it was declared an act of God. Can a jury make that decision, or is that only made by the judge?
I think that's a legal question that the court would have to make, and I'm a little surprised at the outcome, and I wonder if it went to an appeal. The question is, when you hang a sign above a sidewalk, what are the safety requirements to ensure that sign, is it foreseeable that sign will be subjected to a certain wind gust and loading factor, and most building codes require those to be constructed in such a fashion that in the normal course, and I'm not talking about a tornado or a hurricane now, that gets back, if in fact that was a tornado or a hurricane, that might fall into the act of God category, but if it was just a gust of wind, I would be very curious to know, was the sign properly designed? Was it properly installed? Was the materials used of good and sufficient quality with a high enough tensile strength to hold it up there? Interestingly enough, back in the 50s, there was an identical case in downtown Ocala where the then Western Auto Store, which was located on Main Street, which is now Northeast 1st Street, had a sign that was hanging out front, and it fell and hit a lady and caused her a severe injury, and she sued and ultimately, I believe, got a verdict. That was back in the 1950s. I know from my own personal experience in 1973, May 1973, lady was shopping in what was then W.T. Grant, and she leaned over a counter to pick up an item she was going to purchase in the automotive section, and they had automotive tires and wheels hanging from pegboards, and this tire fell off the pegboard and hit her in the back of the head and the back, causing her damages, and we made a substantial recovery for her in 1973.
Wow.
Yeah. The case that I was referring to, the way I understood it, that part of the country is subject to what they call wind devils. They're like dust tornadoes, and this thing all of a sudden came out of a parking lot or something and hit the building, and this piece flew off, so that's why they declared it an act of God.
Yeah. That gets to a legal issue, and I don't know whether that was properly applied in that case or not, or whether the appellate court upheld it. I don't know what the laws are in that state, and I don't know what the weather is. So these are very general comments that I'm making. But the law has a principle that applies, and it's called the principle of foreseeability. And if a normally prudent person should have reasonably been expected to have foreseen because of the unique nature of the climate there. You mentioned that this area is prone to wind gusts or whatever it is that they may call it. If that is something that a reasonable person would have a duty to foresee that, and if it is possible to design a structure to withstand that, there still may be some arguments that it was within the realm of foreseeability and they did not build it. Now, it may very well be that you get into natural disasters that it's impossible to build a structure that can withstand all the forces that Mother Nature can throw at it. And the law does not make an individual who owns property a guarantor of the absolute safety of every person that may walk in front of that premises.
Right.
At some point, the law says, life isn't perfect. We are exposed to dangers every day. Some people are allergic to bee stings and they get stung by bees and die. There's
Right.
not a remedy for every wrong,
Right.
and people
Right.
need to understand that, and that should not be a criticism of our system of justice, because we don't live in a perfect world. They are disasters. They are things that are beyond the human condition to correct, and so we have to do the best we can to protect ourselves and to have reasonable laws that ensure that we have a reasonable expectation of safety when we go about our daily business.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thanks for calling. It's always a pleasure to hear from you.
And you have another phone call. Good morning. You're on the air with John Fuller.
Good morning, Mr. Fuller. Always a pleasure to listen to your show.
Thank you. I always appreciate you calling in. You and the other gentlemen have some of the most interesting and thought-provoking comments and questions, and believe me, I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. You were talking about the reparations. I guess the only race that hadn't received any reparations is, I guess, the descendants of slaves, but that wasn't my question. My question is, right after 9/11, one of the bad things I think that happened in the insurance industry is everybody, if you have commercial property like myself, every time you renew your insurance, you have to sign a waiver if you don't buy that terrorism insurance. And I always tell my agent, well, if I really need that, I'm in bad shape. It's not going to help me anyway at all. But I'm going to hang up and continue to listen to you and let you tell me what you think about terrorism insurance.
Well, gosh, I don't know that I can add much to that that I haven't already talked about. Terrorism, insurance companies could very well go bankrupt if they are forces that attack and do widespread danger. Those are types of issues that may or may not be insurable with a standard insurance policy. Now, could you get what is called a rider that would add coverage? Some companies may add that. I don't know. But kind of goes back to what I say. We live in a dangerous world. It's probably more dangerous now than sometimes. Although I know they advance and move forward and move back the atomic clock based upon the threat of nuclear war. And I think some days it's back if some of the more extreme dictators are deemed to be less dangerous or less psychotic than they are on other days. But it's a difficult thing. You can't insure against every conceivable risk, and you can't be protected against every conceivable risk, and the legal system does not offer a remedy for every conceivable damage that you might suffer from that risk. There are some specialty policies. Lloyd's of London comes to mind as a company that underinsures other regular companies or reinsures for the more esoteric type injuries. Professional athletes who have a demonstrated earning capacity can buy specialty policies that if they end up getting permanently injured, they get a certain amount of money. Hollywood actresses who get paid large amounts of money because they. Betty Grable was probably the first example. She is allegedly or reportedly to have insured her legs for $1 million because she was a pinup queen of World War II, and her legs were her signature beauty point, and so she had them insured in case she got into an accident or something, and her legs were injured, disfigured, amputated, or whatever. That's not going to be going down to your local insurance agent and buying a general claims policy and having that covered in it. But they are specialty insurance companies that charge very high premiums, I might add. And what they do is they spread that coverage among other carriers, but they will insure various unique potential losses, and that's about as much as my knowledge on that goes.
How important is it for you to believe when somebody says, look, I'm ill today because I was exposed to chlorine working at a pool factory, 12 years ago, and just to get away from September 11th for a second, it comes from the September 11th discussion of people exposed to things. But I mean, if somebody comes to you and says, look, my insurance company should be paying for this because it does apply, it's just that it didn't surface till now. I mean, we used to hear the same thing when Dr. Fakori was on. You'd hear about somebody who has an issue with their bones or with something inside of them that came from an accident 2 years ago.
Well, what part of that question delves into the area of law that's known as products liability. And there's been a large number of cases over the years for people who have suffered asbestosis from inhaling asbestos that was used in insulation, used in sidings of old buildings, construction of old buildings. And if you can prove that the company put that in the general stream of commerce and they knew or should have known that it was damaging to your health, you have a couple of technical things that you have to be aware of when you're pursuing a product case, and that is you have not only a statute of limitations of when to bring the action, but you have what is called a statute of repose. And I don't want to get too technical, and it depends a lot in the facts of the case, but if the product has been in the general stream of commerce for more than 12 years, sometimes those claims can be barred by what is called the statute of repose. Another area that we see a lot of litigation going on in is in the tobacco industry, where people the Supreme Court ruled that there was a nexus that had been scientifically proven between smoking and lung cancer, emphysema, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, kidney cancer, bladder cancer, a number of malignancies that have been tied to smoking and secondhand smoke. And I think the science on that is pretty solid. Also, the evidence over the years has disclosed that the tobacco companies knew about it and actually had memoranda of testing that they had done that confirmed that, and they hid that from the public. They targeted their ads on television to attract and make it look dramatic, to enhance young smokers. I think there's some sad poignancy in the Marlboro Man, who was a happy, good-looking, virulent, masculine guy riding across the plains smoking a Marlboro, and 20 years later he's had his jaw removed, he's had laryngeal cancer, and all because he lit up one too many Marlboro, allegedly. So, we are having cases tried throughout Florida every day because Stanley Rosenblatt, a very fine Miami lawyer, he and his wife got $1 billion, I'm just using a number, but maybe it was that, in a class action suit.
That's huge.
And ultimately, the Supreme Court reversed that and said that because the damages to each of the members of the class was so dissimilar, similar, and that's one of the requirements for class action, that all of the members of the class have to have a certain commonality. So they said no, that they were not going to allow this class action verdict to stand, but it was without prejudice to each of those people to go and bring individual actions against the individual tobacco companies, and they have been tried all over the state of Florida.
That actually explains a lot.
There's one pending here in Marion County that got started. A couple of friends of mine are the lawyers handling it. It got started back in the spring, and one of the main expert witnesses became very, very ill, so they had to cancel and postpone it. So these cases are being tried. There was one tried in Alachua County not too long ago. They're being tried all over Florida, and they are recovering $1 million verdicts on a fairly regular basis. A lot of them are on appeal. I don't know.
Wow.
I don't have one of those cases. I'm not involved in one of those cases, so I don't know the details of it.
Wow.
But I do know that substantial recoveries, verdicts, have been rendered for people who say that they were enticed into smoking at a young age without the disclosure that nicotine was addictive, and they became addictive and couldn't quit, and they ended up with severe illness and ultimately death in a lot of instances from smoking.
Wow, yeah. And there goes the smoker right now. we still haven't learned.
You think she heard what we were talking about?
I don't know. Didn't look like it. John, how do we get a hold of you?
Well, we have offices in Ocala and in the villages, and we represent people who have been hurt in accidents or who have commercial business disputes or who've had Social Security disability claims if they are unable to work and they are at their point where they need Social Security. My wife Janet specializes in that, and we do handle complex family law litigation involving complex issues and substantial assets on a limited specialized basis. Our office number in Ocala is 352-547-4292. Our toll-free number is 855-534-2565. Again, we have offices in the villages and Ocala at the Fuller & Fuller Law Firm, and if you have a claim or think you have a claim or a question that you would like to talk with in detail, if you'll make an appointment, we'll be glad to see you.
All right. Always good show, John. You always illustrate why people go to you for help. You can see both sides of your brain working. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Appreciate your help, Larry.
We'll take a little break and we'll be right back.
Ocala's information station, 1370 WOCA. Ocala.
You're listening to WOCA News Talk 1370, Ocala's source for what's happening in today's hottest, up-to-date news and topics.
ABC News Now. I'm Karen Chase. One of the 9/11 victims' family members used the annual reading of the names at Ground Zero to urge President Obama not to bring us to another war. The president is now saying he's willing to hold off on a military strike on Syria to see if a new diplomatic proposal could defuse the situation first. Police in Florida are examining an iPad that his wife claims George Zimmerman smashed during their domestic dispute. She didn't press charges despite making a 911 call.